Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be sitting here with Alan Whitehead, who is the UK Shadow Energy Minister and a member of Labour's Energy and Climate Change team. We're going to be chatting about the Paris International Climate Change Conference and energy matters generally. I hope you find it as interesting as I'm sure I'm going to. So, Alan, I'd like to just start by talking about the Paris COP21 conference, and I think the first thing which I would like to know from somebody like yourself is if you could just explain it to me in simple terms, what you see as being the agreement that's going to be on the table.
Well, it looks like there will be an agreement on the table, and that agreement seems to have resolved a number of the real sticking points that have been there both in the run-up and in the COP itself. Right. Although there still looks like there's still quite a long way to go in terms of resolving some of the really thorny basic issues. But the basic point now is that pretty much everybody is signed up for the notion that there will be clearly, ideally, an effort to reduce global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees by 2050. Now that's obviously a very big ask, in as much as since the beginning of industrial times the world temperatures have already risen by 1 degree C, so it's a lot of work to do in a very short period of time. The remaining issues in terms of getting to that goal are the question of who actually does the main heavy lifting in terms of the reductions. Is it the advanced nations? Is it the developing nations? Is it the poorest nations? Clearly, as far as the poorest and least developed nations are concerned, then they need contributions from the richest nations. Yeah, sure. And indeed, there's a Climate Development Fund which has been included into the agreement. But the question then is it just the richest nations, or is it the developing nations as well who contribute to that effort to ensure that the least developed nations basically develop their economies by skipping the process that the most developed nations have gone through of industrialising themselves and expanding their economies based on fossil fuel and carbon emissions. So can they jump, as it were, straight to clean energy, straight to low emissions economy whilst developing at the same time? And that's really the nub of some of the remaining points in the agreement. I mean, there are a number of other issues, but that's one of the key ones. Who pays what to whom in the climate fund? What size is it? And how is that going to work? And there's also a sub-issue, I think, which arises from how the Paris COP prepared for its own meeting, and that is that everybody on this occasion, or all the nations attending the COP, were required to put things called INDCs on the table, which is the intended national decarbonisation contributions. Okay. And that was thought to be a much better system than had been the case previously in terms of getting towards an overall total of contributions across the world, because it was a bottom-up process. Each nation was putting on the table what they thought they could do within an overall framework of the ambition. And those would then be collected up, and then you see how near they got to the ambition. Now, the previous method of saying what the ambition was and then trying to allocate everybody what they should do clearly led to a number of people not ratifying, a number of people deciding they were going to go in the opposite direction, a number of people deciding that it wasn't fair in terms of the content. So doing this in terms of getting those contributions on the table first was thought to be a much better way of going about it. But when all the INDCs came on the table, and you add all the contributions up, we don't get anywhere near the target of 2 degrees warming by 2050, let alone 1.5 degrees.
Okay, yeah.
So the question then is of how you, if you do sign an agreement at the end of the Paris COP, how you make sure that, having got that framework in place, you get those contributions pushing forward in order to make sure that you really do reach that climate change target. Yeah. And that's where this 5-year re-examination of all the INDCs and how the progress is being made comes about. A 5-year programme, which is also in the agreement, which parallels in some way the UK carbon budget programme, where each 5 years the UK has a newer and tighter budget. And we just had the 5th carbon budget announced just recently for 2030.
Could I just ask you something? Am I right in thinking that the agreement, which say I think is 8 o'clock, hopefully to be announced now tomorrow, hopefully, will that actually come in 2020? Is that the idea?
Well, the idea is that the agreement then, as it were, triggers the action of the INDCs. Comes in 2020 and is then the method by which those 5-year new conference reviews are undertaken. The problem with those 5-year reviews is clearly they have to be done on the basis of a reasonable level of verification that people are actually doing what they said they do, running up to that 5-year review. And again, there's a bit of a sticking point still. As to how you verify those changes and who gets what kind of verification, and whether the verification itself is based on differentiation between states or whether there's one form of verification for everybody. So yes, I think there will be an agreement coming out shortly, but there's still a bit of a way to go.
Yes. Correct me if I'm wrong, the last one was Copenhagen and that fell down, didn't it? And this is the big hope this time. We're not going to fall down.
Well, indeed, by now, as was famously reported, no one was talking to anybody. And then they rushed in the last 12 hours of the conference, in fact, after the deadline had passed, to try and get anything out. And at least the process didn't die completely. But by this stage, it had effectively fallen apart. So the fact that actually we are this close to a communique which at least can work in terms of a framework which can get us through to those next 5-year periods. That's, I think, a very good sign.
So tomorrow, hopefully, is going to be a big day.
I think hopefully tomorrow is going to be a wonderful day in terms of something that really can start to work as far as really getting a global and a fair global approach to climate change. And that's been the stumbling block for all the other negotiations. How fair it is to everybody who's taking part and who bears what burden over what period. And that looks like, certainly with the participation of a number of countries that previously had not participated in the process, like the United States and China, then there is every prospect that actually at least some framework which looks like it's going to work can be put into place.
Yes. While we've been chatting, to see various people watching and put forward any questions, can I just put you at any really key questions which people from the UK and hopefully around the world ask? We have had one question from a viewer saying, what can individuals do to lobby MPs on the issues?
Well, certainly as far as this country is concerned, what will happen immediately after the COP is done, and we hope that the communique is issued, is the UK will then have its own agreed contribution, which looks like it will be 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 over 1990 levels. And although it is true that in terms of the way the British carbon budgets are going, it looks like the UK can reach that target, i.e. we can carry out, from the UK's point of view, our initial agreements. As things stand at the moment, we fall away pretty badly after that. So in terms of what we've looked at in the UK in terms of the UK carbon budgets, we can fulfil the first 3 carbon budgets and probably get to that sort of target overall.
Yeah.
4th carbon budget, we're some 10% out, and on the present reckoning, the 5th carbon budget, we're badly out, and that's on present measures. So the lobbying particularly has to be on what new measures are you going to put in place in the UK to get us on track for those budgets subsequently, because we are so far away on those later budgets at the moment that we would stand no chance of really meeting improved goals that will be necessary for the Paris COP to work. And I mean, the other thing which is very immediate is the extent to which some people have said then the British government has been talking a very good talk at the climate change talks themselves about the UK's role in all this, and the imperatives of making sure that the communique is agreed and signed. But at the same time, within the UK, just over the recent months, there's been a lot of activity which appears, and certainly as far as climate change is concerned, to point in the opposite direction. Things like removal of underwriting for renewables, cancellation of a carbon capture and storage programme, which is going to be absolutely essential for UK climate goals in the future. Well, we were, and well, we still are, effectively, in terms of what has happened so far and the structure of the next immediate period. But my concern certainly is that with the measures that are being put in place at the moment, those won't just be short-term measures which perhaps save a bit of money now and save customers a bit of money on their fuel bills, but they will actually be much longer-term damage kind of measures, which will be very difficult to row back from in order to get us back on target. So the lobbying, I would say, is as importantly to say, well, why right now are you, the UK government, doing measures which appear to move away from reaching that target, whilst in Paris talking in favour of that target? And what are you going to do to get us back on track as early as possible?
I have another question for you, Alan. Why is nuclear power not a solution?
Well, nuclear power in the UK is set to fall away very substantially in the next few years. Now, nuclear power, let's be clear, is low carbon but isn't renewable. That is, it requires fuel, it requires a lot of expenditure in nuclear power plants, which themselves have quite a lot of embedded carbon in them. Okay. And obviously there's a very substantial decommissioning programme which involves, among other things, burying large amounts of nuclear waste for thousands of years under the ground. So no way is it a renewable technology. But has been argued obviously by a lot of people it's very low, relatively low carbon, and therefore it should be a part of the process. Now in Britain, the old nuclear power stations will pretty much all be offline, with the one exception, by the mid-2020s. That means we'll have a very low level of nuclear power generation after that point. And new nuclear power stations will not be online until probably the late 2020s. And at present we've got one nuclear power station that has been not, I mean, it hasn't yet been financially agreed, but there's a suggestion that it's going to be commissioned. It's very, very delayed in terms of when it might come online. It hasn't been built yet, obviously. And the concern would be that actually by the time a new nuclear power station comes on stream, in order to keep the lights on in Britain, to keep the energy supply going, you will have need to have built all sorts of other power sources, possibly a number of new genuinely renewable power sources, so that when a new nuclear power station comes on stream, we'll have done the heavy lifting of putting a lot of the decarbonisation in anyway. So the question at that point is, do you need a nuclear power programme if they're going to be over budget, cost a fortune, don't come in and produce power till 8 to 10 years after they say they're going to be. Is that a really reliable part of a programme to have for the future?
Yeah.
So it's not really a question of whether they're safe or unsafe, or indeed even how much nuclear waste they produce, although that's a real issue. It's a question of what role they play in the UK economy in the future. And might you be better when we're talking about 2030s, 2040s, to actually go for a much higher level of real renewables in the economy, so that we know we can build them and we know we can reach our targets.
If I could just, for the benefit of people who've joined more recently, I'd just like to repeat to people watching still, here chatting to the UK's Shadow Energy Minister, Alan Whitehead MP, and we're talking about the Paris Climate Change Conference and about energy matters generally, and obviously Alan has specialist interest in the UK's energy policy. From your standpoint, what would you like to say to people about what they can do as individuals to improve their so-called carbon footprint?
The most important thing I think anyone can do, we can do collectively, and we can do this almost on a daily basis, is just reduce our energy footprint and reduce our energy use and make better use of the energy that we do use. And the reason I say that is that something like 60 to 70% of all the emissions that this country puts out, carbon emissions, are pretty much based on how we use energy, in what way, and what are our choices for energy generation, transmission and use. And yes, there are a number of other key issues, some of which become particularly important in future years. For example, the way we eat food, the way we use land, all those sort of things have considerable carbon emission implications. But it's about the energy right now. And unless we radically reduce our energy use and radically change the makeup of the energy mix that supplies that energy in the first place over a very short period of time, literally 15 to 20 years over the next period, then we'll have no chance of reaching our overall targets. And what that means then is, if you are going about insulating your house to reduce your energy use, if you're going about putting renewable energy on your house in order to net off your energy input and output at a local level, if you are engaged in decentralising energy in any way in order to actually mean that there's less burden on central energy generating arrangements of the country, so that in future we don't have to build a whole load of new fossil fuel power stations to power the country nationally, because we've actually taken up quite a lot of the slack that they'd otherwise provide by our own arrangements locally, then you are doing something very positive. And
So for instance,
believe me, if enough people,
well,
it starts with that, but it's a whole series of not fundamentally altering how your life is led, because frankly, if everybody has to go and live in cupboards and live on candles in order to achieve these targets, then we're never going to get there. It's about living a life something like we are at the moment, but on a much more frugal basis as far as energy use is concerned. Then that's the sort of thing we can do at a local level to really make a difference. And believe me, if enough people do that, if enough people change how their energy works, change their energy use, and you imagine doing that in cities and towns across the UK, city by city, town by town, location by location, that makes an enormous difference.
Do you think that, say in the UK, that we could be introducing incentives to people to do this?
Well, of course we have. Under some circumstances, we had the feed-in tariffs for putting solar power on people's roofs. We've had underwriting for onshore wind to put turbines up in wind farms or individual turbines. There's also been an incentive put in place to develop much lower carbon heat, which is often forgotten about. A lot of people think this is all about electricity generation. Well, it's not. It's about how we heat our houses and how we use gas and heat in our houses and our commercial premises. So we've had incentives for a number of those things to happen. And the other thing, of course, is the extent to which we really are making a big effort nationally to get our homes much more energy efficient. And again, there were programs in the past to allow that to happen. And that's absolutely the other side of the coin as far as electricity generation is concerned, because obviously if you've got a house which uses 50% less energy than it used to, then that's 100% saving in carbon emission. It's the most efficient thing you can do by far. So the idea that we have properly insulated homes, that they work well in terms of being mean with the energy that is being used in the house, and that you can go about your daily business on the basis that you know not only your bill's going to be much cheaper, but actually your energy use is going to be so much better, then that's probably the best thing to do. And again, that's a serious enterprise. There are millions of homes that are not properly insulated as far as their walls and roofs are concerned. There are something like 7 million homes in the country that are solid wall houses, and so they need rather more than just a bit of cavity wall insulation. They need proper treatment on the house, and that could be quite expensive, and there have been arrangements to help people do that. And again, I'm afraid to say that the most recent spending review has radically reduced the ambition for the number of houses being insulated over the next period in the UK, which again seems to be pointing directly away from real action on climate change. So I'm really very worried about how that is now going to proceed. And we clearly got to gear up a lot more radically and a lot more rapidly in getting UK's homes properly energy efficient over the next period.
Can we hope for a strengthening of building regulations?
Well, again, we could have done. I'm sorry, I'm sounding a little like a broken record here, but we did have a code for sustainable homes in Britain, because obviously the question of energy efficiency in houses is twofold. Firstly, we have got a very energy efficient housing stock as it stands at the moment. We've got to get that back up to scratch. But then there's also the question of, when we build new houses, do we build those to be so relatively energy efficient you don't need to go and treat them again subsequently? Are they in the bag as far as energy efficiency is concerned? And the code for sustainable homes that there was around was a code which meant that the building trade would be required to increase the efficiency of new building year on year on year as new building came on stream, and eventually you'd have a situation where homes are effectively zero carbon. That on a net basis that would probably entail some kind of energy generation in the house as well, but on a net basis you would be consuming no energy on the basis of no net emissions in the house. Now, I'm afraid to say that code has also been withdrawn.
Can one dare to hope, drawing it back to the Paris, can one dare to hope that any agreement reached in Paris will turn the tide of all this?
Well, I think the next period is going to be a period where everyone, say in the UK, comes back from the Paris COP. Let us hope that it works as well as we think it is about to, and will then come back to Parliament and say, right, we've come to an agreement that there will be a statement immediately after Paris COP from the Prime Minister, no doubt, about the talks, and at that point Britain will have its contribution set in stone, as it were, by the Paris Agreement. So the next question at that point is, if you cannot show how in the UK you are going to match deeds with words as far as getting us to that commitment, then the mechanism that we've already agreed, the Climate Change Act, which everyone pretty much agreed with at the time, 5-year carbon budgets coming from that, they mean if you're failing in one area, you've got to make up in other areas in order to keep on target overall. So the question then to the government is, well, okay, you're not apparently going as fast towards the target as you should do on wind and solar and energy efficiency, what are the other areas you're going to make it up in?
Right.
And how are you going to make these carbon budgets work? And that, you know, in the end, you've got to show one way or another, even though there's some room to move about within the carbon budgets, that the carbon budgets themselves are adhered to. And that seems to me the big political debate that's got to happen over the next period. It's not good enough simply to say, yes, we agree with the targets. By the way, we're knocking the props out from everything that gets to those targets, and we're not telling you what we're going to put in place instead. You've got to have new things in place in order to make sure that that target is reached.
So, going back to this hope for agreement tomorrow, let us just hope that that is a start of a new way again in Britain, and getting back on track and doing better things.
That's right, and it's not. And again, it's not just a question of saying, well, we're sort of on track, okay, so we don't need to do much more. We know, and indeed, pretty much everybody at the Paris COP knows, that yes, we might make progress, but there's going to have to be an awful lot more hard work done in order to make sure we really do get there. So simply saying, yeah, we're going to reach our next lot of targets, that's okay, we can now relax, is not good enough. It's got to be a continuous process, and it's got to be a process now that plans for the longer term future. And that's the real work that's in front of us.
Well, I think we'll be drawing to a close now, and I must say thank you very much, Alan, for chatting to me and everybody who have been watching. I've learnt a lot, and you've gone into really good detail about everything. I wish you all the best for tomorrow going forward, and it'd be most interesting to see how you and the opposition are going to hold the government to account, and that the government are held to account generally by us all. So thanks very much for chatting to me.